Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us again this week. We're committed to bringing you webinars that are timely and want to bring experts and collaborators to the platform to discuss the importance of SEL in this very current context. Many of us are feeling a sense of extreme urgency as we reflect on what's going on in the world, what's going on in Minneapolis and around the country, and are asking ourselves what we can do right now. As parents and caregivers, one critical action that we all must take is talk to our children about race and racism. We've shifted the programming this week so that we can bring you information to help you have these very difficult conversations. And our hope is that you'll keep having these conversations long beyond this webinar or this moment. Having these conversations will require us to tap into our own social and emotional competence so that we can also model and promote social and emotional competence for our own children. We have to have the self and the social awareness to identify and process our own difficult emotions at this time and recognize with empathy and with understanding what others are also going through. We have to reflect on our own identities and our own role in systemic racism. And we have to have the relationship skills to listen, to communicate, and we need to have responsible decision making to actually understand the impact of our own actions and the impact of our own inactions, and to make a commitment to this important work. I'm honored and really, I think, feeling fortunate to be able to introduce to you our presenters today, who will be sharing their expertise and their perspective on how to engage in this mission starting at home with our own sons and daughters who are looking to help us shape their understanding and make sense of the complicated and important events, both historically and today. Bloodine Barthelus works at CASEL. She's one of our key district consultants working with school districts to help them implement systemic SEL. Before she joined us, she was also a school counselor and successfully developed programmatic solutions to help increase student achievement and growth. She will also be leading this discussion with Dr. Deborah Rivas-Drake. Debbie's a professor of psychology and education at the University of Michigan, and her research examines how school, peer, and family settings can support adolescents in navigating issues related to race and ethnicity, and how those experiences inform young people's development. You may also know her book, Below the Surface, talking with teens about race, ethnicity, and identity. Debbie and Bloodine, please join me on the screen.
Hi, Debbie. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. I would just like to thank Karen Nemi and CASEL and the entire CASEL CARES webinar team. We really appreciate your responsiveness and your sensitivity to the climate and the needs of our broad community. And really just looking at how do we shift the webinars to ensure that we are answering the questions that are top of mind for those who are really plugged into these webinars and really plugged into finding resources during this time. There are literally no words that can adequately describe the anguish, the despair, the sadness that's gripped my heart, and I know yours, Debbie, and even all of our participants over the past week. To the family and friends of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and all others who have personally lost loved ones due to racism, we send love, and we say to you that we will never forget. And we hope that webinars such as this becomes the action and the focus of providing strategies of how we continue to carry your name forward in the work that we do. A question that continues to come up during this time is, what do I do? How can I help? I have to say that as parents, and I'm a parent too, we probably sit in one of the most significant spaces of power to shift racism. What we do in our homes and how we show up for our children during this time will have ripple effects for generations to come. In our conversation today, what we want to do is really help to clarify the opportunity that we have as parents to really support our children in recognizing and challenging racism when they see it happening. We want to raise awareness around the power that we have to shift the narrative around race, around racism and inequities that happen. And then we want to make sure that you leave with some practical strategies and tips that can really empower you and empower us, even as we speak about it as parents, to be better positioned in this work before and after the current events. So who am I and what brings me to this conversation? Like I mentioned, I am a parent. I'm a Black woman, clearly, residing in the United States. I'm a daughter of Haitian immigrants, Joseph and Ruth Barthelus, who parented 6 girls, all the time stressing the importance of our common humanity and how we live and move in this world, along with stressing the importance of education as a lever for equalizing opportunity. Above all of that, I am a parent. I'm a mother, a single parent of a 15-year-old male who keeps me on my toes. And I know that we live in a society that does not see him and values him in the way that I do as his mother. I know that when he steps outside of my door, he's going to encounter racism in a way that he's possibly never even imagined outside of the conversations that we've had. And so my call and my impetus to do this work is to create a better world and to put the seeds in place so that when he is no longer under my covering as a mother, that he has a better world to walk into, that he has a better opportunity to be who he is without fear that his life can be taken just because of the color of his skin. And so that's what really does bring me to the work. Debbie, how about you? What's bringing you to the work and to this conversation?
Thanks, Bloodine, for sharing your positionality. And I want to also thank Karen and CASEL for having this webinar and for inviting me to be part of it, and for us to be able to have this time together to talk about this really, really critical issue. What brings me to the work is, first and foremost, I'm a person who's committed to challenging specifically anti-Black racism. And I have been. I really thought about this question, and I thought, you know, when might be the first time that I thought about this issue and sort of owning it as something that I'm responsible for intervening upon, right? And for me, it goes all the way back to when I was a teenager, right? And really trying to make sense as a daughter of immigrants and thinking about what it means to be an American and, you know, who's permitted to embody that or to own that category. And then also thinking about anti-Black racism within the Latinx community. And, you know, how does that show up? And where do you, you know, kind of intervene even with family members and community members, people you value and cherish and love, but who also can espouse these views? And, you know, what's your role in intervening upon that? So I've been thinking about these issues since I was a kid. And I'm also a parent, like you mentioned, I'm a parent of 8-year-old twins. And we have, obviously, I'm trying to walk the walk. I'm a parent who's trying to walk the walk and having these really, sometimes, you know, challenging, sometimes funny and awkward conversations since they were 2. I think I tried to start, you know, around 2 or 3, and my husband and I, and really trying to model what, you know, the kind of person and adult that I want them to be, and specifically as someone who owns the work of challenging and interrupting anti-Black racism. And I'm also a researcher. So I've been studying these issues as a professional for over 20 years. And I'm specifically really thinking about what we know about child and adolescent development and families and schools and peers, as Karen mentioned. And, you know, how can we bring that knowledge to parents and educators, you know, not just the research community, but really sharing it out and really trying to provide those strategies that are based on, you know, many, many decades of work by many very, thoughtful and rigorous scholars. So that's what's bringing me to this. And the other thing I want to mention is we are in a CASEL community event, and I want to say that in the last few years I've been thinking about social emotional competencies and social emotional learning and how they intersect with these kinds of issues in society. And so what is the place of social emotional learning when our concerns are about advancing equity and disrupting racism, and where can they intersect? So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're going to just jump right in and just think about just clarifying this opportunity that exists in this moment for parents, really around the space that we're in. And when I think about that, that prompt, what I'm considering is, when I was in my one of my first grad classes, I had a professor who opened up the class with this question, and he said, "How do you raise a racist?" And of course, we're all, first of all, shocked by the question, but then throwing out all sorts of just ideas, and you demonize other ethnicities, or you name certain supremacist groups or white supremacist groups as powerful and having validity in their approach, and you come up with all of the obvious answers that you would think of. And his answer to all of that was no. And he finally said, "You do nothing." And we just had a conversation around that, and the reality that we are walking in a very race-based society. There is systemic oppression that is happening. There are media messages that we get and that we give, sometimes at unawares. There are messages that our children are getting on a consistent basis. And if we are not literally intentionally feeding a counter narrative to what children are getting, what students, what young people are getting, then we are almost creating a breeding ground for racism to flourish. And it's a hard pill to swallow as a parent. It's hard to recognize that the world is having a conversation with my child about race right now. It's having a conversation on a consistent basis. And if I am not being intentional as a parent to have my own conversation, then what my child is taking in is what becomes reality and truth to them. And so I think this is the opportunity that exists for parents now. Like, whatever messages children are taking in right now, they're creating a narrative with that. And do we know what that narrative is? Have we asked? And that is an opportunity that we have. So I truly believe that as parents, we are the first teacher and probably the most powerful one. No one holds the level of importance or impact as a parent. Even in our absence, we're shaping their lives. And we have the opportunity to create a counter narrative. We can humanize the conversation in a way that sometimes it isn't. Many times it isn't in the news. And we can mobilize within our own homes against racism, and really to create the actions and the conversation and the language around how do we stand as a family, and how do we represent anti-racist beliefs and attitudes and actions. So to be silent is really to breed racism, and to breed racist thinking that continues for generations. And I want to I'm going back to my counselor days. I thought about this as I was kind of considering, just thinking about this webinar. When I was a school counselor, we used to have units on bullying, and we used to watch this video called Broken Toy, and this is on the elementary level, so you can do these conversations at all levels. But in this video, there was the bully, there was the victim, and then there were the bystanders. And in the video, the bully pushed the student to the point that he ran across the street and got hit by a car, and then that weekend, then everyone was alarmed, like we are alarmed right now, and wondering, like, well, I should have said something, right? And we talked about the fact that when you looked at the bully, singular person, the victim, singular person, and the bystanders, who had the most really shift what happened in that scenario? And we finally landed on it's the hundreds of bystanders that watch it happen and don't say a thing. And so our opportunity really is about empowering our children to really step up, take action, and really just use the power of their voice, the power of their presence to shift the systems that are in place that continue the racism and the inequities that we see on a consistent basis. So we know that these conversations are not easy conversations. We know that when parents jump into wanting to talk about racism, we're bumping up against a lot of just significant challenges around how do we really frame this in a way that really gets the message across in a way that our children can carry it when they're not with us. So, Debbie, what are some of the ideas that you have on how parents can really frame that conversation and deal with some of the challenges around having a conversation about race that they can really take on and apply as they move into next steps?
Well, one thing that I like to say, it's a great question, is that this process of challenging racism, of becoming an anti-racist and raising anti-racist children is like a highway. So I use that metaphor all the time. Not everyone gets on at the same place, and not everyone's going to get off at the same place. And I think that knowing, there are so many challenges. And I also want to call out that we have been emphasizing conversations, but I think that it's also really important to think about actions. And to have a conversation is an action, but it's just one. When I was preparing for this, I asked my kids, and they will just tell you the truth, right? Like, because there's sometimes no filter, so they'll just tell me, what they really think. And so they said, I asked them, what do you think kids need to know about race and racism? Like, mommy's going to be talking to folks about this. What do you think would be a good question to ask kids? And they said, one, how can we teach people to be kinder to Black people? And the other was, what can we do to stop it? So both of them were really, they're 8 years old. They're very focused on, what are we going to do? Like, what can we do? And I really appreciated that. And I think, like, listening to for a couple of reasons. One is listening to our kids. So sometimes the challenge is you're feeling like, is this, should I have this conversation? Should I broach this subject? Like, should I talk to them about racist violence? Maybe they're too young, maybe they won't understand, maybe they don't have a framework. But another thing that I want to tell you is when we are having these conversations, we actually, about what's happening right now, and we've been having them since they were toddlers. We say, we sort of, start to talk about it, and they'll clarify, like, oh, but we already know what you're going to tell us because we've overheard you talking about the videos on the phone that and so I won't show them, right? I won't show them the news. But I will talk to them about the news, about what's happening and why it's happening in terms that I think that they can understand. So I think it's knowing, like, the contours of what should be in this conversation, knowing how to, knowing your child, how to approach it. And then also, like, the when and where and how and the language. So I would say that there's probably, a lot of different approaches. And also I want to very, very be very clear that there are families for whom there's not a privilege of choosing to have a conversation. As you mentioned, you're having to have a counter conversation, right? Like a conversation that challenges everything that your child is being taught about what it means to be a member of your group. And the conversation that I'm having is a different type of conversation, of course it's related, it's about there are these systems that sort of work together so that if we don't challenge them, basically everything will just reproduce itself, right? Like if you do nothing, then it will just persist. But the nature, right? So every family context is different, and every parent-child dynamic is going to have like its nuances. And I think knowing that and sort of recognizing that is one of the things one of the issues. And I would say that if you're afraid, so the fear and the trepidation about broaching the subject, as a person, focused on in my work on adolescents, it's a lot of times the parallels are, how do I have a conversation with my kids about sex and sexting, and it's so scary, and drugs and all of these like scary topics, and I would say it's like sex, drugs, and racism are, really hard to talk about. But,
Yes.
if you don't tell them, they're gonna learn and they're gonna get information about these issues anyway. What do you want them to know? As you mentioned earlier, I think that's like, what do you want to be intentional about what they are walking away with? What are the information, the perspective, and the understanding, like upstanding and bystanding, recognizing that in their everyday life, in peer interactions, in school, in the community. And I think those are all things that you have to be intentional about, because if you avoid naming things, avoid calling it as you see it, and really being clear and giving them, especially at my, the kids in my age are or my kids' age are, really like, can you help me? Like, I need a definition, first. By the time they're 15, they, there's some basic understanding they already have. Now you're talking about a different type of conversation, different level conversation. But I think if you don't give them the language early on, it's much harder to get to a place where now you're talking about systems and systemic racism when they're 15. If you've never had, if you've sort of evaded using racial language or naming things as racism, right? All the way through. So it's a process, and it's pretty much part of parenting, in my view, from 0 to when they become independent adults, and even then, I think it can continue.
Yeah. And what you just mentioned about it being a process, it's important to recognize that parents are on their own journey and their own process as well. Race isn't a finite thing. There is so much to be learned. There's so much of the narrative that we need to counter, but there's also just some educating that needs to happen for us to finally feel. You may not feel comfortable for quite some time having these conversations with your child or your children. And I think what you mentioned, even asking your children, like, how would you want me to talk to you about race? What do you need from me? I think that's something, it's a great way to start. And I think for myself, even asking my son that same question, like, how would you want me, even though I've been doing it in my own way, how would you want me, to talk to you about race and racism? And he was very clear on, as a teenager, just, I don't want you dumping information on me. I want to feel like you're listening. I want to be a part of the conversation. I want to talk about how I feel. I want to talk about, what's coming up for me. So to me, my takeaway was, I don't need to come in with a full, syllabus of exactly what I'm going to talk about with my child about race and racism. You're right. By the time they hit 15, they already have some ideas and thoughts and sentiments about race. They already have some ideas around racism. They have ideas on why the country looks the way it does. And I think for us as parents, that listening with intent to understand is one of the biggest pieces and gifts that we can give them, really at any age, and really allowing them to become a part of the solution and not just being this container to take in information. They have ideas and thoughts on how to shift the problem. And sometimes their thoughts and ideas might be better than ours, because we've been a little bit more tainted than they have. They tend to think outside the box in a way that we don't always. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
I think that's a really good point. I think we don't think about sort of the conversation goes both ways, and you're responding as well as initiating. And I have to say that our conversations, I don't know about you, but some of the ones I've had, it seems to always be, I tell my students this all the time, like I was on my way back, before the quarantines. I'm on my way to the store and in the car. It's always in the car or in a kind of like, it's not like all these conversations are planned. Like, okay, now we're going to sit down and we're going to have a talk about, and I think that's true for even the talk, right? The talk that Black families have. It's not the talk. It's many little talks and the big talks and talks all the time, and different ways of talking. And so I think that that's true for other families as well. Is just making kind of like taking up the opportunities when they appear, when they initiate, when they ask a question. And if you don't know the answer, I think modeling humility is really important. I think parents are afraid like you're supposed to know everything. And the truth is, you're also on a journey and learning too. So there's a couple of things with that. One is own your journey. There's so many, I cannot tell you, there's so many so, on social media, there's so many postings about, how do you talk to kids about race and racism? And I think a lot of it is really geared toward like what you say, information dumping, like here's what you need to do and tell and say to your kid. But to be honest, it starts first with you as a parent. If you haven't thought about it, you haven't learned the histories, if you haven't read and tried to unpack your own emotions, your own identities, your positionality, where are you coming at this conversation from? Your kids will tell you that they will recognize that you are not being authentic. Like they know you, right? Sometimes a little bit scary how much they know and recognize, right? Like, so that you want to say, I'm on a journey too. Like if that's where your reality, let's figure this out together, So we wanted to also, I think we were asked to really think about guiding principles, and I want to make sure that we kind of touch on maybe some of those, Bloodine, if that's okay. One that I've just sort of alluded to that I'm just going to say really clearly is, if it's not clear already, name it. Give your child the vocabulary that they need. So when you are, talking about or processing together different incidents and why the protests are happening and, et cetera, name it. Say they are challenging anti-Black racism. That's what it is. Here's what happened, right? This is racist violence and this is why. This is what it is. And I think so. I think really, owning that. And then like I would want to say that one other thing kind of tying into the naming and is really thinking about the victims of this racism and violence as whole people, like humanizing them. So the Say Their Names campaign and effort is to me is really is about that. It's like they're not just a statistic. They're not just like a video that went viral. That person had a family. They're a member of a community. They're a brother, a sister, a parent, a child. And telling your kids, like reminding them that. I mean, I think that is really important. Is really recognizing the humanity of the victims. And that those and helping them to understand, like that the emotions that might raise for them. It's like it's not just this abstract concept, it's like a real person, and that's really hard. So I don't know if there are other principles or guidelines that you think, guiding principles you think we should emphasize, Bloodine.
Absolutely, and I think we've covered a few of them, but something, this idea of showing up and being authentic when we're in spaces with our children. And I think you're absolutely right. They know when we're being real. They know when we're walking the walk, or when we're just paying lip service. And I think diving into just radical self-awareness, really taking the time to be true to yourself and identifying what are the biases that you bring to this conversation? What are some of the assumptions that you're making about people regarding race and ethnicity? For whom do you feel indifference? You know, how long does it take for that sad feeling to go away after you see another Black body on the street? Like, and question that, you know, that is telling you something. The feeling is not enough to get you to action, but the feeling gives you an indication as to what's happening within you that you should shift and change. And so if you notice that if you are in a white body, you have privilege, you know, and how does that privilege show up for you? You know, if you are in a Black body, you have dealt with racism in a way that your colleagues may not be able to understand. Like, how are you unpacking that, you know, and really start noticing how we react or respond to issues of race. All of that is information that can help us to better understand who we are in this conversation about race. And I will say that without doing that work, it becomes really difficult to be the example for children around being anti-racist. We can talk about it, but if we're not modeling it, they see it, you know, and you can't assume that children just know because they know you, you know, they know I wouldn't be racist, you know, like they need to hear it, they need to see it, and those need to match, you know. And so I would say this idea of really digging into who are we as parents, what are we representing in this conversation about race and racism, and are we representing what's required for our children to walk into that conversation in the right frame of mind to counter and to actually push against and resist those who feel like racism is something that should continue in this country. So I would say own the work of your own self-awareness.
And I totally agree with you. I think it's so critical for people who want to do the work alongside Black people to do that work, because you cannot be a true ally, accomplice, you know, co-conspirator if you haven't, you know, thought about why, you know, what do you do with your own emotions? Do you sit with them and not actually take action, or can you model that for your kids? Like, I turn my emotions into something that is going to actually then disrupt, right? These patterns that we are seeing. And I think you just need to do it until it's second nature, and your kids know, they'll recognize that as well. So I think we are wanting to we want to make sure that we turn to the questions that our participants raised when they registered, and I think we're just about at that time. I wish I would love to go on and on.
There's never enough time.
Conversation. And so I think, you know, there are a couple that we have touched on about how do you talk to young kids. I want to just give you the participants who asked about that a quick example. When my kids were 2.5, they asked about, and this is kind of reflective of what we see in the research literature. It's like they notice differences. So are you starting to give them the language then? So one thing that I like to say to folks who ask me about this is, like, they notice the sky is green, blue, the grass is green. You know, this person has brown skin, that person has, what color skin would that be? What color skin is our skin, right? And that's the moment where you're starting on a process. And if you don't take advantage, like right then and there, it's to say, oh, you know, I never thought about it. I never had to think about what color my skin was. That's a great question. Mommy, what color, what color is our skin? What color is it, you know, is that like, you know, and then they're just curious about the world. And if you stop that conversation out of fear, that's the first step. You've already missed an opportunity. So you can do it even with toddlers. So do you, I think there are a couple of other questions, or if you want to also address that one.
Absolutely. And I think part of that question, the question that links directly to what you just answered, is how do you address, this individual said, I want to allow my students to vent, but also teach them how to do it in a positive way. How do I address it when a student is in their emotions and actually says something that's racist. And so I would say, and Debbie, you can feel free to add to this as well. I would say you don't get much leverage out of an emotional conversation. I think what needs to happen in the moment is that student, that child needs to know that what was said was inappropriate. There is no place for what was said in this room, in this time, or ever. And then you're going to have this conversation. Right now, we're not at a place where we can have an honest and solid conversation around what you just said and all of the issues or events that's fueling the emotion that you have right now. So we're just probably both going to step away from this and come back when we're a lot calmer to have really a conversation that can be beneficial to the both of us. But I think you have to you can't let that slide because the person was too angry. I think you have to name it in the moment and let them know that that was unacceptable, inappropriate, not something that should ever come out. And then when you do have the conversation, unpack it. It's oftentimes we want to stop the behavior from happening. And I get it. Nobody wants to hear something that's racist, but the behavior was an indication that something else is there. So you just gotten some feedback on something that needs to be addressed. And I would really recommend that I would just say that the way that you address it allows the student and the child to recognize that it's safe for them to be who they are in all of the craziness that they might show. Like if I'm feeling a certain way, or if this is a word that I feel like is easy for me to use, if I say it with this person, it's not going to change the way that they feel about me, but they're going to help me get to a place where I can better position myself in society. So I think you have to create a safe space, but you have to name what's not appropriate and create the space to really unpack and understand, how did this student arrive at understanding that this was appropriate to ever be said, So I think you got to do both. You have to do both, but you need to create the space where the emotions are at a place where people can think rationally and logically about who they are as individuals. Is that who they want to represent, and who they are as it relates to the people around them in our world, in our society?
I think those are great points. And this question about students also, I think I want to recognize that some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of parents and caregivers really apply to educators, although that's not the focus of our conversation today. And I think this whole idea of recognizing, like, having the wherewithal in the moment to, depending on your positionality, right? Like, to sort of be able to disrupt what is happening, the behavior, right? Like calling it out, and thinking about calling in and calling out, right? Like, what is the outcome that you want to see? I mean, there's harm that could be caused to that is being caused to other students potentially, and there's harm to the community, right, of the classroom. And so you want to interrupt that, right? Like disrupt that harm. But then at the same time, you kind of, I mean, if you feel a sense of responsibility for that child learning and getting on a journey where they're learning, like, these are not acceptable things. And not only is it not just acceptable, but that there's here's what you're missing, right? There's another way to view the world and to, like, be in this world and to interact with people. And I think that is a little bit, it's exactly what you said, you want to have them be receptive to that type of conversation as well. And with kids who are your kids or your students, if you admonish them, you're going to stop a behavior, but you're not necessarily going to, and I think that's important. You want to immediately interrupt harm that is happening, okay? But then you also have to be thoughtful. And I mean, I empathize so much with educators who have to be kind of juggling all of that, because as a parent, if I am responsible for that, I have the benefit of, like, having multiple tries, right? Like multiple opportunities at home. And okay, I tried this, it didn't work. Okay, it's another way. And or maybe I didn't, I sort of I'm wagging my finger at them instead of actually saying, let's, like, engage in a process where we're trying to unpack why you did that, like, or why that happened. Whereas an educator, it's sort of like, you don't necessarily get another chance. So it's really important to disrupt there too, but then also be thinking like, how can you circle back to these issues, not just with the student individually, but as a community. So that's what I would say about that. And I think that's true. We have a question about being an ally to Black people when I inadvertently continue to show microaggressions or allow them to happen. So this is a really great question, because I would say that if you're showing microaggressions and you're allowing them to happen, that you're not actually being an ally. So I would say that you want to ask yourself, like, what is stopping you from interrupting these microaggressions when they happen? It's really uncomfortable to be in a position where you have to kind of course correct a colleague, right? Or I would say a family member, even, right? That's a really challenging position. There's so much work that shows that the power dynamics, right, of the interaction really matter in terms of whether people are willing to receive, the like course correct, right, like allow themselves to be course corrected, but then also whether you're able to actually say something in the moment. So I would say when those situations are happening, what is the dynamic of the situation that is making it hard for you to, or that's like encouraging you to continue to allow them? And why can't you say something in the moment or have a private conversation with a microaggressor, at another moment? Because that's part of also a process of disallowing them, right? Having a private conversation. Maybe you feel like you can't say something in a more public setting, or there's a lot of anger or something, right? There's like different emotional contexts, and then also the power dynamics that play into that. And so, really thinking about like, maybe I don't feel equipped to do it in a public way, but actually, as I do more work on my own, right, allyship, and really working toward being an ally, I can find ways where I can even role play, like literally role play, really just practice being comfortable and saying, I'm going to take that person aside and say, you know what, like when you made that comment, I don't know if you realize this, but such and such, right? Or that joke, I don't know if you realize it, but it wasn't funny. And on top of that, like, or it wasn't funny, and here's why it was harmful, right? Like, I think that is part of your work that you have to do. So the inadvertent, I think if you recognize that you are that you are allowing them, I would say that you are complicit, right? That you're not inadvertently, that you just feel like not equipped to do it. So there are a lot of resources that we're going to share, Bloodine and I have collected, that I think would be great for this person or people who have this sort of situation to look into, right? And like I said, this is the highway, right? You're getting on somewhere different than someone else, and this is going to be your work to do.
Absolutely. And I think that's where you just left off is exactly right. I'd like to pick up is about the work, the work that you do on yourself and questioning your own biases, your perceptions, your ideas, and what you bring to the conversation. But we also have to recognize that if you were educated in the United States, you have probably had faulty education around race. You've probably had faulty education around the ethnicities that surround you now. And I'm going to take the word probably out because you have. Our system of education is a system of oppression. It was created in a way where the white culture was dominant and remains superior, and with the exception of a few token individuals from other races, everyone else seemed inferior, and so that is what you are having to, you've got families, and it's not just you. Every single person who went through that educational system has gaps. You have gaps in your learning, and I appreciate the fact that you want to be an ally for Black people. But I think one of the biggest ways that you can be an ally is to learn about Black people. and to learn about not just, what did they endure, not just the struggle, not just slavery, civil rights, and then now, let's learn about the brilliance. Let's learn about, the contributions to civilization that still make up the world that we're in right now. Balance out the narrative. It wasn't struggle from the beginning, and I think it's important because until you begin to see who they are in totality, who we are in totality, the whole person, as you were saying, Debbie, it's really hard to get off of the idea that there is this superior race versus an inferior race. It's really hard to start balancing that out when we don't start balancing some of the information that we've been given. And it's the same thing for our children. I would say when you're thinking about becoming an ally to Black people, you're raising white children who can become allies to Black people as well. So think about the, sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think
I
that was
lost
me.
you for a second.
Yeah, I would say think about the images that you are always taking in, the images that your children are always taking in. Think about the books that you read to them. Are they filled with the same faces, in the family, or do you have faces of a whole range of ethnicities? Are the topics ranging from, the accomplishments to maybe the struggle of us as a humanity? Like, really diversify what you read, what you take in, become well versed in the human in the human population that you are a part of. Because right now you know yourself and you know what you've been told, and to really support those who need the support, you've got to learn a little bit more and add a little bit more to your repertoire. And although Black people are in a position, and I will speak for myself, although I am willing to have the question asked, but it's better for someone to come to me with a question when they've searched on their own, and it shows me that I was valuable enough. It meant enough to them for them to take the time to learn a little bit about me before coming and getting some information. I don't want to be a walking encyclopedia for the white race. I don't, but I do want to be a partner. And part of being a partner is doing our part in learning what we need to learn to really develop our own content, our own knowledge, and developing what we have as far as capacity to bring to the conversation of race and racism.
I think that's I think it's so clear, right? I think, and what I really appreciate about what you said, one of the things is that you said, I want to be a partner. But I'm going to tell you that, there's a lot of folks, I think, who think that, and then I think now who are approaching their colleagues, their friends, and looking to them to be encyclopedias, and that completely inappropriate. I would say, show care, love your friends, be there, be a support. Don't expect them to do your work for you, and don't expect them to help you do the work for you, do work with you. It is not Black people's job to do your work. And that's true for not just, I want to be really clear about not just white people, but non-Black people of color from other communities, right? It's not Black people's job to do that for you or with you. It's not. So that's one of my principles. Do all of this, like read, explore, unpack, struggle through this with your kids, with your friends, etc., without burdening, and further traumatizing Black, especially if you've never had a conversation about race, or you're in a cross-race friendship where the issue of race has never even come up. So is that is now the time where you're going to say, okay, let's talk about racism? I think it's so disingenuous. There's very few friendships, that could withstand that. I think if you knew that your friend was coming at you coming at this process from a place of love and care, and and you really authentically felt that, genuinely felt that, that's one thing. But I personally, it's our job as non-Black people to not burden our our coworkers, our colleagues, our friends with our issues, right? These are our issues. Like, we're dealing with our own feelings and frustration, and we don't know what to do and all of that. And so let's deal with it ourselves, with our own, folks who can do that. We can do that work with together without burdening Black people. So I think that, we have this question about how can white parents help to inform their children of color? And that's a really good question. And I would say that it comes up in the literature a couple of different ways in terms of transnational adoptions, adoptees, and then also, of course, white parents raising Black children, or any children from any other minoritized group. And I think that you especially have to do this work. Like, they are trusting you. You're the first person, your mom, your dad, your grandma, your whoever it is that you are to them, and you're their caregiver. You are especially responsible for doing this work, and not just letting it be something that you are addressing when it has to be addressed because something has happened and they're ill prepared. I say, learn, right? Do all that work that Bloodine was describing, and unpack, right? Like, your own socialization experiences, how prepared you are to disrupt and anti-Black racism and xenophobia, or whatever it is that comes up for you, and how you do that in your everyday life. And this is for all parents too. Like, how can you model those actions for your kids, right? And show them that, that you have an active role in that process. And then, if you're not in communities where, I think this is true for any parent, the United States is very segregated, and we're more segregated now than we had schools, at least, than we were pre-Brown v. Board. And I think that we want to help our kids have an understanding of those patterns, right? Like, if you're raising children of color or a child of color in a community where there are not a lot of people like them, you have to help them understand why that is, and you can't just let them fend for themselves. That is, I think, really absolving the critical role that you have. And yeah, so I would say that there's probably communities that you can connect with. I will try to make sure that we include a resource specifically that addresses that issue. And maybe if there are parent networks or communities that folks can tap into of other white parents, who can do that work together, who are doing that work together, I think that would be probably a good idea. Do you want to add something to that, to answer that question?
I think that's probably, I think you covered it well. I would just go back to the idea of really building that child's identity, and making sure that they have the opportunity to really know who they are, outside of, I'm so appreciative for this question, because it shows that you're asking the questions that would set your child up to be able to navigate this world with a strong sense of self. And that is probably one of the biggest gifts that you can give your child, because it's already when you present as a family, that is something that they're already going to have to deal with because of the world and the society that we live in, unfortunately. But if they're able to navigate, the family that they're in addition to being able to know personally, this is who I am, this is my lineage, this is where I come from, and this is what that means for me. You're positioning them in a way that they can navigate through some of the most extreme challenges. So I would say do the work to really help them to become as self-aware as possible. Do the work to ensure that they have the opportunity to voice and to manage the different emotions that come with that. And I would say you're on the right path by asking these questions, but that identity piece is critical. And if they can walk away with that intact, you've done a phenomenal job as a parent. I think our time is just about to run out. It feels like there's never enough time to have conversations like this, and these are conversations that literally can go for hours. We want to kind of think about what are some final takeaways that we could give you as parents, and for us as parents as well, that can kind of carry us not just through this time, but just in general around race, around racism. It's not a conversation that will go away once the protests stop. I think the work, another leg of the work, let's think of this as a relay. Another leg of the work begins after the protests, after the news has moved on to a different topic. That's where the other leg begins. And so a few takeaways that we'd like to share, that I'll share, and then Debbie, I know you have a few that you'd like to give as well. We've been talking about this for quite some time, but I think one of the biggest ones is committing to doing the personal work that's required to really build your own understanding about race and about privilege and identity and how those two intersect. Really understanding about systemic oppression and why our country looks the way it does. There is a reason. There is a reason why, I think it was Archbishop Desmond Tutu who said, at some point, you have to get tired of pulling bodies out of the river and go upstream and figure out why the bodies are falling into the river. There's a reason why these things are happening. Don't quote me on the way that I just said that, but you get the gist of it. There's a reason why our country looks the way it does. So put time in your schedule to really dedicate to learning. I mean, maybe it's 15 to 20 minutes a day. It's a podcast, and there are books that you can read. And if you don't have time to read, you can put it on an audio book. You just have to create the space, make it a priority, and also create that space for your children as well, for them to begin to understand the world around them with a bit more accuracy. So that's really important. The other takeaway, I'll give three. The second takeaway is the conversation about race and racism and all of the other pieces of that is hard. That's just the reality. It's a hard conversation. It takes courage. It takes thick skin. It's a commitment that you have to have, that we all have to change, that will keep us at the table when we feel offended, when we feel misunderstood, when we feel frustrated and angry, and a host of other emotions. Like we can't leave the table. We can't leave the conversation because we felt a certain way. Just continue to engage, So I would say just choose to stay at the table, figure out where to have those conversations, have them with your children, ask the questions, and see what comes up. And I am pretty confident that if you are open to having those conversations, the right people will show up to continue to push you in that direction. The opportunities, life just happens like that. The opportunities will come up for you to exercise some courage, and sometimes you'll fail, sometimes you'll miss it. Pick yourself back up and let's do it again. I fail sometimes, I miss it, but I got to pick myself back up and just keep going. And then the last takeaway that I give is, as a family, really talk about what your core values and your guiding principles are. What guides your family's approach and your response when racism occurs? How do you commit to be as members of the Johnson family or the Smith family? And how does this make the world better? How are you really taking a step out of just, we kind of do our own thing, but no, as a family, how are we contributing to the well-being of our society? And how are we recognizing that when I hurt, someone else is hurting as well? When someone else's family has lost someone to violence, it's an injustice that threatens my own family as well. And so I think that common human piece is something that we have to think about. So what are the principles? What are the core values that guide your family? Have that conversation and really hold one another to that. And when racism comes up, How does that align with our core values? How does that align with our principles? And what actions do we need to take to realign to what we say that we're about as a family? Debbie, what do you have?
So I have just a couple that I would add, or that I would offer. And I've said these kind of throughout our conversation today, but I would just want to reiterate. One is to name what is happening. Give your kids the vocabulary, starting from a vocabulary of differences, how differences map onto power, how anti-Black racism operates. Learn that for yourself, and then help your kid guide them through that understanding, and then what you're doing to disrupt those systems, or that system of racism. And that can take a lot of form. Be intentional about it. So I think naming it intentionally is really important. I would say also to humanize the people that are being talked about and displayed in media. There's research that shows that these videos go viral. They are very damaging, even associated with PTSD. In kids who are exposed to them. So we kind of, and then we also don't get a chance sometimes to learn about there are some folks who we are seeing, information about who they are, like who were they as a person, what was lost, like what did this world lose, what kind of, we get to humanize, right, like the loss, and know that the communities and the families that they were a part of are grieving, and recognize that, and respect that, and honor it, right? Like by recognizing and respecting and honoring that they were a whole person. So I would say that that's really important. The third one, the final one, I guess I want to say, is understand that it's a process, that you have to recognize that if you weren't taught how to do this. I wasn't taught how to be anti-racist. But it's been really fascinating even to see growth in my own family, folks who are older, who have evolved. Like, it's not over, right? When you're an adult, you don't know everything you need to know, right? You are in a process, and you're on a journey, and understand that and approach that with humility. And then also don't forget that along with reflection and understanding and learning and awareness of emotion and et cetera, that's sort of hindering you from actually doing something, is go figure out what can you do? What are the things that you can do, and then do them. And do all that without burdening or leaning on Black people if you are not a Black person. So those would be my key takeaways for today. So I think that is all the time that we have, right?
Yeah, it is. It's been a pleasure, Debbie, just having this conversation with you. I know that it's not enough time, and for parents who are watching, we know that this hasn't answered, even scratched the surface of the many questions that you may have or may be coming up for you. So just as Debbie mentioned, there are some resources that you will be able to get that will come along with the recording of this webinar. So we're hoping that you will have the opportunity to dig into those resources and get some more of your questions answered. But it has been a pleasure really being on this webinar and having this conversation, and being hopefully a part of, the ongoing solution to this issue of racism in our country.
Likewise, Bloodine, thank you so much for sharing this time and space with me. Just as a parent, parent to parent, and also obviously as a professional, I just really appreciated all of your insights and thoughts on this issue. And so, yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Let's do it again.